Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Ganesh Sitaraman. I'm a professor at Vanderbilt Law School, and I want to welcome you to our panel entitled The Second Gilded Age. Before we get started, a couple of comments and rules of the game here. Please turn off your cell phone or put it on silent. Actually, what you should do is put it on silent or vibrate, and the reason why is the second rule, which is if you want to tweet, you should feel free to do that, which you obviously can't do if your phone is off. So feel free to tweet. The ACS Twitter handle, as you probably heard, is at ACS Law, hashtag ACS 2017. If you are interested in getting CLE credit, this session, I'm told, is eligible for that, and you should go outside the doors right there and talk to the staff. There's a table outside where you can get your CLE credit. We're also at the end of the early remarks and some of our conversation going to do Q&A. There is a microphone right here, so please stand and get in line when we get to that stage. So that's just some early work. As I said, I'm Ganesh Sitaraman, and our topic today is the second Gilded Age. And one of the important things I think that we've all noticed in the last few years, and particularly since the financial crash in 2008, is not just rising economic inequality, but also the concentration of wealth and economic power. In almost every sector of the economy, we see consolidation of economic power in a small number of firms. We see rising inequality among individuals. And in addition, we see this economic inequality turning into political inequality, shaping our political system and potentially even threatening our constitutional system. And so that's the broad arc of the topic for our panel, and I'll introduce our panelists. First, we're going to have Elizabeth Wydra. Elizabeth is the president of the Constitutional Accountability Center, and from 2008 to 2016, she was the chief counsel at the Constitutional Accountability Center. Previously, she was in private practice at Quinn Emanuel, where she worked on Supreme Court and appellate issues. We also have Zephyr Teachout. Zephyr is a professor at Fordham Law School. She is an expert on corruption in America and has a terrific book entitled, shockingly, Corruption in America. But you may know her also from her very inspiring runs for governor of New York and for Congress. We also have Lena Khan. Lena is a fellow at the Open Markets Program at the New America Foundation and at the Information Society Project at the Yale Law School. She works on antitrust competition policy and the effects of business concentration on the economy and on law and policy. And then finally, we have Karen Wong-Ervin, who's director of the Global Antitrust Institute and is an adjunct professor at George Mason's Law School. And she previously was an advisor and a counsel at the Federal Trade Commission, where she also worked on antitrust issues and government investigations. So with that, what I'll do is I'll start us off with Elizabeth Wydra.
Thank you, Ganesh, and thank you so much for coming to our panel. I'm really excited to be here. I always love the time of year when it's the ACS annual convention. It's great to be with all of you and to be on this panel with such an esteemed group. So the panel title posits whether there is a second Gilded Age. And certainly when it comes to the Roberts Court, it most definitely is. Now, I'm not going to say it's like that scene out of Great Gatsby where they're at the party and there are fireworks and champagne fountain and Leo DiCaprio raising his, coupe of champagne and giving you the wink, but it's kind of there. Business is excited. And it's not as if this party was just thrown together at the last minute, a bunch of plutocrats getting on a group text saying like, hey, party at 1 First Street tonight. Chief Justice Robert, get some beers. It's been something that has been long time in the making. There has been planning and strategy for this big business party at the Supreme Court. And I think it's helpful to think back to 1971 when soon-to-be Justice Lewis Powell wrote a memo to the National Chamber of Commerce noting that in what he perceived to be this attack on American business, there was something that was overlooked by the business community. he spoke of a neglected opportunity in the courts and noted in his memo to the chamber that the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change. Powell recommended to the chamber that business should become more astute in, quote, exploiting judicial action, calling it a vast area of opportunity for the chamber if it is willing to undertake the role of spokesman for American business. The chamber took Powell's advice, which was pretty smart of them, given that he was about to be on the Supreme Court, and now the National Chamber Litigation Center serves as the voice of business in the court on issues of national concern to the business of community and files amicus briefs in most of the major cases that pit big business interests against the government or individuals. Now, my organization, the Constitutional Accountability Center, thought that that would be a great way to take the temperature of how pro-business the Supreme Court is now and has been. So we undertook a study of the modern Supreme Court era, beginning with the Burger Court, and used as a barometer, since the National Chamber Litigation Center talks about itself as the voice of business in the courts, how well the chamber did with each of these iterations of the Supreme Court. And the results were very interesting, and for those of us concerned about accumulation of wealth and power and insulating business from accountability, disturbing. The Burger Court, the chamber, had an okay success rate of 43%. The Rehnquist Court, not exactly a, radically liberal court, upped it a little bit, but not that much, 56%. But in the Roberts Court, we've seen a spike to 69%. So that's going in just a few decades from about 40% to nearly 70%. And we see a clear ideological divide on these important business cases. Justice Alito votes with the chamber a whopping 74% of the time. We see Justice Ginsburg, on the other hand, siding with big business in 45% of the cases. So we see this clear split on the court, and as we have a further entrenched conservative majority on the court, and given the reaction of the business community to Justice Gorsuch's nomination, we have every reason to believe it will continue with him on the bench. We're seeing a very pro-business court, indeed the most pro-business court in the modern era. And now how does that translate into what it means, particularly for individuals who are harmed by corporate wrongdoing, and in the antitrust space, monopolistic behavior? Well, the general trends that we've seen from the Roberts Court in these business cases is a hostility to class actions, a closing of the courthouse doors through raising standards of proof, pleading standards, making it harder to get into court, making it harder for plaintiffs to prove their case, whether they're trying to get a class certified or whether they're trying to actually win on the substance. And so that general anti-access to courts, pro-business doctrine that we're seeing out of the Roberts Court intersects with antitrust in important ways. We've seen cases just during the Roberts Court that takes these trends in the antitrust context, making it harder, for example, to show through regression models that there's sufficient commonality to certify a class in an antitrust case, raising the standards for proving monopolistic behavior and damages. And again, what we've seen in the general context also holds true in the antitrust context, an intention to shunt individuals into arbitration, where, as we've seen, it's generally stacked in favor of the corporate interest and against the individual. So there are a lot of individual cases that we can talk about, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will talk more about the details, but that's how we've gotten to this moment in the Supreme Court and with the general context of a pro-business, anti-antitrust court.
So thanks for that. That's a good overview of how the second Gilded Age may operate in the courts. And so I'll turn it to Zephyr Teachout to maybe tell us broadly about why we should be concerned about economic power and its relationships to political and political power and legal issues.
Great. In 2 to 4 minutes, I got it. I in my last race for Congress, I experienced this directly, where some of you may have heard of Robert Mercer. As far as we can tell, he spent the most money on Donald Trump, the second most on Ted Cruz, and the third most supporting my opponent in the congressional race.
Wow.
Despite that being a point of pride for me, I'm going to talk a little bit about corporate power in other ways, but in the background of all this, I'm not going to focus on it as much because I think you already know it. One of the most important antitrust decisions of the last several decades was Citizens United, in that it let loose corporate power in our elections. And in competitive elections, one of the biggest undertold stories about 2016 is in competitive congressional elections, more money was spent by super PACs than by candidates themselves. So that super PACs start to play a larger role than parties and candidates in our basic politics. That got a little obscured by Trump. What I mostly want to talk about today is how we are in the middle of a very dangerous, whether you want to call it monopoly or concentration revolution in our country that threatens our freedoms. I actually think of this moment as a kind of Scylla and Charybdis moment. There's the Trump on the one hand, and there's corporate concentration on the other. And while we fight the abuses of the Trump administration, it's incredibly important we don't take our eye off the concentration that's happening elsewhere. So in 2015 and 2016 were the highest number of mergers on record each year. There were 48,000 mergers last year. Well, people were debating whether or not Cruz or Bush would be the Republican nominee. Pfizer was merging with Allergan. DuPont was merging with Dow. And I'd suggest that we think about that as those merger pages are political moments. Think about the War of the Roses. The mergers between families or the mergers between companies are the creation of new forms of political power when we're dealing with levels of concentration like we're dealing with right now. Just as a DC example, 20 years ago, you had 175 defense contractors. Now there's 5. In the seed area, Monsanto owns the patents to over 80% of the corn and soy seeds. In area after area, whether it's the Verizon merger or in banking, you see this incredible, really rapid, really the last 20, 30 years, consolidation, very quick move to just a handful of companies that are controlling. And then in the digital area, it's different because it doesn't come from mergers in the same way, although there's vertical mergers that allow it, but you see Facebook, Google, Amazon really controlling our lives. And if there's one thing that I can get across today, it's that this is a political emergency, not merely an economic emergency. This pushes down wages. It leads to inequality. It makes it incredibly hard for small businesses to compete. But it also affects who makes the basic decisions that govern our lives. And for most of American history, everybody understood that. Thomas Jefferson wanted an anti-monopoly clause in the Constitution. In the same letter in which he wrote Madison about the First Amendment, he said there's an anti-monopoly clause missing because he was worried about publicly enabled private power coming to govern us. Or Charles Sumner, who you remember for being beaten on the halls of the Senate, talked about taking the train through New Jersey. How many of you did that recently? As riding through the Valley of Humiliation. This had nothing to do with New Jersey. Because the great railroads would say to you, I am your Lord and God, and you are my servant. Talking about the railroads in political terms. It wasn't just that they were doing all kinds of terrible things in the economic realm. They were coming to govern us, to govern the small businesses, to govern their employees. And the greater concentration you have, the more you have what justices understood throughout most of the 19th century, a form of private government that threatened our form of public government. I just want to give you one example, and I'm thrilled to be on this panel with Lena Kahn, who did some of the original reporting on this before she became a lawyer, to give you a sense of how this is political. In the chicken industry, there's a thing, actually in the meat industry in general, there's a thing called chickenization. And I'm about to describe it, but this is spreading into other areas of the meat industry. They're independent contractors who sell to Tyson. You're a farmer, you're an independent contractor, you can sell your meat to Tyson. You got to take out your own loan, you take all the risk, but you're sure that Tyson's going to sell your food. Well, here's the thing. Tyson tells you as an independent contractor what kind of feed to use. Otherwise, your food can't get to market. And by the way, there's nobody else you can sell to in that region because Tyson's the only seller in that region, right? Tyson tells you what kind of watering system to use, what kind of housing you need, what kind of lighting you need. Basically, they're controlling what you're doing, even though you're an independent contractor. And you're not allowed as this chicken farmer. You look, on paper, you look like, oh, look at all these small businesses. You're not allowed as this chicken farmer to talk to other chicken farmers. Part of the contract is that you can't talk to other chicken farmers about what is in your contract and how much you're making. All kinds of problems with this, but I want to tell you about the real political problem with this. When Vilsack and Holder held hearings on this chickenization issue all around the country, farmers did not show up because they were scared if they showed up and spoke out about what was wrong with this system, they would not get the feed they needed and they would not be able to sell their chicken and they'd go into debt. Lena did some of the early reporting on that. That's political fear. That's political fear. I've talked to publishers who won't go on the record on this, but have that relationship to Amazon. Suppliers have that relationship to Walmart. And so I think we have a tendency to sort of deal with politics here and deal with economics here, but we have to understand that there's a growing political, that the concentration of power leads to a political tyranny, not just economic tyranny. And the last thing I want to say is that I think it's so exciting that ACS is holding this panel because one of the reasons ACS was founded, as I understand it, was as a counterpoint to the Federalist Society. Well, if you're going to be a counterpoint to the Federalist Society, you got to go at the heart of where the Federalist Society started, which is antitrust and monopoly. The Federalist Society doesn't treat monopoly as a side issue, as antitrust is a side issue. If you look at the history of the Chicago School and the Federalist Society's relationship to that, that's saying if we want to take over this system, we've got to go at antitrust. So we'll talk in the rest of the panel about solutions, but I hope that we recognize that there's a crisis that we have to address with the same fury that we address the crisis in campaign finance reform.
So this is a great transition because, Lena, I think you can tell us a little bit about the history of antitrust in the last 30 to 50 years in 5 minutes, let's say, and where we are today.
Sure. So yeah, thanks to ACS for holding this important conversation. So I think we're at an interesting moment right now because I think antitrust advocates and reformers have multiple axes on which to contest the current approach to antitrust. So a lot of the debates about the values and kind of what the goals of antitrust should be are not new. They were most recently fought in the 60s and 70s, which is when the Chicago School first introduced the idea that the primary goal of antitrust should be to advance economic efficiency in the form of consumer welfare. There was some pushback at the time. Scholars were arguing that economic efficiency and consumer welfare were nowhere to be found in the legislative history. But at that moment, the Chicago School won a pretty decisive intellectual fight. And I think we're living at a moment, and after they won that fight, with the election of President Reagan, they were able to stamp those ideas into law and policy through both the antitrust agencies and through the judiciary. We're living at a moment now where we've seen 3 to almost 4 decades of that regime, and I think our current political economy in a very real way reflects the antitrust regime that we've been living under. And what do we see? We see in sector after sector extreme concentration, as others have mentioned, airlines, seeds, book publishing, retailing, rental cars, hospitals, health insurers. I mean, it's just on and on. And I think it's becoming pretty clear that the concentration is not just a problem that's limited or isolated to a particular few sectors, but in fact is now a defining and systemic feature of the American economy. I think this is also true in sectors where it seems like there's a lot of variety. So people often point to the beer industry as a sector where we've seen kind of, resurgent craft brewing and more diversity. But if you look beneath the surface, there's actually 2 companies that control 70% of beers. These 2 companies also increasingly control the distribution apparatus, which lets them then squeeze out the craft brewers or buy them up. So oftentimes, even when it seems like there's a lot of variety, we're seeing an illusion of choice because companies often own multiple brands. Even The Economist magazine has, in the last year, had 4 cover articles kind of lamenting the decline of competition in America. So this is really becoming something that is more widely acknowledged. Another great thing has been there are more and more studies documenting not just the fact of this consolidation, but also exploring what its potential effects are. So in the last year, we saw the Council of Economic Advisors issue a report documenting the decline of competition across the economy. They also issued a report linking this decline in competition to falling wages and assessing the effects on labor, both when it comes to labor's share of national income, which has been falling, but also connecting it to disparity among pay, disparity in pay among workers. We've also seen great studies from this economist called John Quokka, who's been assessing the effects of mergers that have been approved by the Federal Trade Commission, and he's found that routinely companies go on to hike prices. The Federal Reserve has also issued some great reports in this vein, showing that manufacturing companies that have merged routinely also hike prices without any attendant kind of rise in efficiency. Both the Brookings Institute and New America have also offered studies showing that there's been a dramatic decline in entrepreneurship and small business growth. So on a per capita basis, we're creating half as many businesses now as we did 30 years ago. And to be sure, there are a lot of things that have changed in our economy. You know, new technologies and free trade agreements have obviously transformed the economy, but I think it'd be naive to think that antitrust law, which is at base about how we structure our markets, hasn't had something to do with all this. I think, you know, these studies let you make a second line of argument. So if the primary line of argument is that, you know, antitrust is foundationally about trying to preserve a political economy that distributes wealth and power and control, the second line of argument is able to hold antitrust up even to its current metrics, which is primarily consumer welfare and efficiency, and shows that even on its own terms, the current approach to antitrust law has failed to kind of preserve the kinds of competitive markets that we would want to see. And I think for that reason, it's an opportune moment to ask if something has gone awry. I think looking forward, reform efforts, there are two things to keep in mind. One is, as Elizabeth mentioned, you know, antitrust, the robustness of our antitrust regime at this moment is highly dependent on the courts. Judges have interpreted antitrust law at this point as a semi-common law regime. You know, they've taken the fact that the statutes were written very broadly as giving them wide latitude to kind of adapt antitrust as they see fit. But it doesn't actually have to be that way. You know, if we understand antitrust as being a set of principles about how to organize our political economy, we can actually embed those principles in other kind of policy spaces through other levers and mechanisms. So for example, thinking about how to embed competition policy principles in administrative law, you know, requiring agencies to take account of the effects on competition of their actions. So I think, you know, thinking about reform efforts going forward, we should think about how to embed antitrust principles beyond just the courts. I think the other thing to keep in mind, as Zephyr mentioned, is that the growing power of internet platforms is really quite unprecedented, and I think any serious reform movement will have to take into account not only how antitrust law presently is blind to the powers of these platforms, but also whether we need to be thinking about other forms of regimes, be it public utility or other kind of common carriage, to address their power.
Well, so one of the things that's come across in the last two comments is thinking about antitrust not just from the perspective of economics, but from the perspective of political power and the impact that it has to have massive consolidation in industry on politics. But Corinne, I think you know, the perspective of antitrust traditionally is not, in the last few decades at least, is not focused on those questions. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you see the world of antitrust and why that system makes sense.
Sure. So thank you to the organizers for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. You know, for me, it's very interesting to hear this debate because I haven't heard it. You know, I've read that it happened, you know, in the 50s about concentration, but in mainstream antitrust community, we're really in broad consensus that consumer welfare is the appropriate standard. So I worked at the FTC under former Chairwoman Edith Ramirez, who you know, was under Obama, and I also worked for then Commissioner Josh Wright, who was the Republican appointee. So I worked for both spectrums, and I'll tell you that in writing speeches, there was just no brainer. We do consumer welfare. Where we see the conflict is abroad, you know, so in China, in India, and Japan, they really want to use non-competition, non-economic factors like the healthy development of the socialist market economy or employment or inequality, you know, more central planning kind of ideas. And the U.S. agencies across administrations have really said, you know, consumer welfare is the appropriate standard, mostly because, you know, so you have to remember, it's not economic efficiency, it's not total welfare, it's not consumer plus producer welfare. Antitrust, you know, as set forth in this by the Supreme Court in the late 60s and 70s, is only consumer welfare. It only looks at whether consumers will be harmed. And this is really a broad concept, you know, which values what consumers are willing to pay for. And it also really ties it to the methodological commitments of economics, which gives you testable implications from theories of harm. You know, I don't know, as an antitrust person who's worked on these cases and you know, now I'm in academics and trained foreign judges and enforcers, but having spent decades doing the cases, I don't know how you would consider other factors. So, you know, for example, it's very difficult already to determine whether conduct is pro or anti-competitive, whether if you see conduct that's widely used in the economy by firms with market power and non-market power, it suggests that there's some legitimate business reasons for it. So it's very difficult already. And so introducing sort of inequality, poverty, non-economic factors, I wouldn't know how to weigh and measure those. So, you know, normal antitrust cases, you look at a narrowly defined relevant antitrust market, whereas sort of non-competition factors could be in different markets. I don't know how to weigh and balance those. I also think that antitrust is dynamic and forward-looking, whereas looking at things like employment or, you know, small businesses may be more static. So there's a tension there. I also think that, you know, there's trade-offs. So you risk some, you know, predictability and transparency in antitrust, and that our current agencies have long said that they're ill-equipped to consider these other factors. You know, that these may be factors that us as a society think, yes, these are important, but that other agencies with those relevant expertise should consider them. So what the FTC and DOJ have long told China, India, and other agencies is that if you're going to consider other things like inequality, fairness, at least do the competition analysis first so that you know what welfare gains or losses you're trading off, and then be transparent about what kind of industrial policy or central planning or you know, other goals you want to consider. The last thing I'll just say is that you know, with the concentration debate, I'm not sure what concentration has to do with harm to consumers. So the empirical evidence, you know, there's very little empirical evidence upon which to presume, sorry, I'm being waved at, sorry, to presume that there's any kind of systematic relationship between concentration and market power. You know, market power being the ability to raise price or reduce output. And you know, the study that was mentioned by the Council of Economic Advisors, it cautions, it says consumers are not necessarily worse off, you know, by higher concentration. So I guess I would like to see more, you know, analysis before jumping to concentration necessarily is an antitrust issue. Remembering that antitrust really looks at whether there's unlawful acquisition or maintenance of market power. And the last thing I'll say for real is that Trinco, you know, one of the most recent Supreme Court cases on antitrust, was signed by both Scalia and by Breyer, you know, and Trinco really hit home that antitrust is meant to be a consumer welfare prescription, and that, you know, we allow monopolists to charge the highest prices that the market can allow, because this is what incentivizes innovation and R&D and development in the first place, and that high prices actually induces entry. It's what signals to a marketplace that this is attractive, this is profitable, and will lower prices over time. With that, I'll stop.
So I think a good place to start here is just to clarify a little bit of how we think about antitrust and why it's important. So I think what Karen just outlined is an argument that focuses deeply on economic benefits, particularly to consumers. And so maybe Lena or Zephyr, if you have thoughts about this, maybe Lena, like how do you or others in what some have called the new Brandeis movement, wanting to reform antitrust, how do you respond to the economic challenge that Corinne presents to you?
Sure. So I think it's important to underscore a few things. First is that the consumer welfare approach to antitrust is actually historically anomalous. So before the 70s and 80s, it's not how we approach antitrust. So it's not something that was kind of integral to the founding of how we viewed these laws. I think the second thing to say is that, and one of the things I was trying to underscore is that even within the consumer welfare paradigm, we're at a level where concentration actually is resulting in higher prices. So we saw this in the rental car industry, for example, where the FTC allowed to a couple of pretty significant mergers, and sure enough, the next year they hiked prices. This is something we've seen in the airline industry repeatedly, where even though the price of oil has dropped, airlines have maintained fares or even raised them. So I think there is some tension with the idea that we're both seeing more concentration but not also seeing rises in prices. I think that's something that is becoming increasingly obvious. I think more generally, it's important to recognize that there are already a whole lot of kind of indeterminate assessments that go into antitrust analysis. So I think this assumption that we have a very clean set of economic analysis that's only looking at prices here, and that all these other factors somehow introduce all this ambiguity, I think it's worth questioning whether that's actually how some of the analysis works. I think more generally we're at a moment where we're seeing that the effects of concentration are in fact affecting us, not just as consumers but also as workers. Is also affecting kind of the dynamism of the economy. And so I think it's worth thinking about how competition policy more generally should address this, even if it's not necessarily coming from within the FTC or the DOJ. And so I think kind of expanding the competition mandate in that way is important.
So I just want to add on to that and reinforce one of the things that Lena said is that up until the 70s, we had a really, I'd say the most robust regime is the 1945 to the early 70s. We had a robust, workable, functioning antitrust regime that dealt with hard questions, and judges are used to dealing with hard questions, and it functioned. Number one, this is workable. Number two is that it's incredibly important also there's this funny thing that happens whenever we have this debate, which is a lot more frequent now, is that, and this honestly happens with lawyers on the left or Democrats as well. I mean, you're absolutely right that there has been a consumer welfare consensus for a long time. There has been an understanding of the scope of what antitrust is. I think that is a wrong consensus, but it's an accurate description that there has been that consensus. But you'll say, well, we got to deal with this problem of concentration of power in the banking industry and the seed industry. Let's deal with it with antitrust. And antitrust lawyers will look at me and say, antitrust doesn't do that. Antitrust. I say, well, what area of law does that? We say, we don't know, but not us. Go deal with campaign finance reform. Go deal with this other area. So what's ended up happening is we've actually lost the language. And one of the most amazing things that the Federalist Society was able to do, the Federalist Society and the Chicago School were able to do, is not just destroy our laws, but destroy our language. Because anti-monopoly was a central part of our American politics for most of our history. Antitrust was part of our politics. It wasn't this dry thing that a few technocratic lawyers did. It is fundamental to our freedoms. So when you hear this move, antitrust doesn't do that, there's a consensus that antitrust doesn't do that, we got to make antitrust do it. Or let's come up with a new name. I actually do think anti-monopoly might be a more useful name or way to talk about it. But we can't accept this like we don't do it, and therefore there's no language to do it move. So related to that, there is an incredibly important space for legislative action. Setting aside this Congress, there's still members in this Congress, maybe in the minority, and there's maybe opportunities for people across the aisle who can at least introduce new ideas. The great Senator Phil Hart, towards the end of his career, was really focused on antitrust and whether we should introduce cap and spin legislation, putting an absolute cap on the assets of a company. I just raised this as a possibility. Senator Kennedy, I think, proposed a limit of, $500 million in assets or something 25, 30 years ago? There was an active legislative debate about when do companies get too big. I want to deeply agree with you and say this is a problem. One of the problems is that Democrats got out of this fight in the 80s and 90s. So that Democrats, there's a huge problem with the Republicans, but there's also a huge problem with Democrats sort of ceding the field. So we have to get back in there, be proposing legislation, be suggesting that be at the PSC fight. Some of it's going to be at the state level and the local level. That's all for now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to note that, this is not just an economic issue. And I think going back to the founding is a really important corrective to that, because I don't think that the founders were concerned about accumulation of economic power and monopolies simply because that it might result in not as good prices for consumers. I think they were also concerned about the political implications. And I swear he did not pay me to do this, but I think that's why your book, Ganesh, is so important that you just put out. It's really great. You should all read it. Crisis of the Middle. Yes,
that.
he did not. No. Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution.
Corruption in America.
And talking about the ways in which the idea that we have a diffuse economic system, that we have diffuse power in our economic system, is linked to our role as citizens, is linked to our ability to be citizens, equal citizens. And I don't know if you want to speak about your book a little, but I think that it's very relevant to this conversation to take it out of just this, well, either you prove that it's bad for consumer welfare on these economic measures or it's not, and that's the only conversation we can have.
So I'll just say one thing about that, taking the invitation. The question, I think, as we talk about all these issues, I think why we're having a panel here on antitrust is it gets at a core constitutional problem, which is that you can't actually have a real republic if you don't have a distribution of power in society that is spread across all of the people. When you have concentrations of power, whether it's economic power or political power or any kind of power, is a threat to freedom. And that is in conflict with the idea of republican or representative democracy. And so that's at the heart of what we're talking about. It's at the heart of why this is a project for the American Constitution Society, beyond just being something that maybe would get talked about at a conference for academic economists or political scientists or something like that. But we've talked about a couple things in terms of reforms. I want to throw one more thing on the table as part of the conversation. So both Zephyr and Lena brought up the question of internet platforms and internet companies. And I know, for probably everyone in the room, you use internet companies or tech companies in one way or another. And you probably like a lot of the things that you use from them. And one of the features of them, though, is that monopoly may actually be useful. And the reason is when you have a networked good, the value is everyone being on the same network. And if you have kind of broken up networks, you actually lose some of the value. So I'm curious to those who've mentioned internet companies, how do you think about the problem of internet platforms, particularly, and is the answer breaking them up, which is, I guess, what I would think of as an antitrust answer, or is it some sort of regulatory system like how we regulate electric companies or the railroads, or are networks just totally different and we have no idea of what even the model is for how to think about these new technologies?
Well, Tim Wu said maybe 7 or 8 years ago, to love Google, you have to be just a little bit of a of a monarchist. But I think that was too generous, because Google, regardless of the sort of ethical standards of its owners, has an obligation to its shareholders first. So, which a monarch at least has the opportunity to be a benevolent monarch, whereas Google's a little more constrained. The threat presented by these platforms is quite significant. Just look recently at the explosion of fake news and to the way in which so many of us then turn as supplicants to Facebook, asking Facebook to be our censor for us. That's a really disturbing political situation for us to be in. To be saying, censor news for us, be our judge. I don't think there's easy answers on this, but I want to sort of lay out some broad principles that I think are important. In general, and Ganesh sort of referred to this, there's a lot of different things we can call on in the history of competition policy, but the two main tools are either breaking things up or requiring neutrality. So and some kind of, whether you want to put it in the sort of common carriage neutrality category, like railroads, we say it's worth it to have these railroads that are deeply integrated, but they don't get to treat one farmer different than another farmer. They actually have to take everybody's carrots equally. So in terms of the platforms, my tendency, and I'd love to have a whole panel discussion just on how to deal with the platforms, and their political importance cannot be understated. But my general tendency is to think about two principles. One is the principle of neutrality. If we're going to have these kinds of global networks and rely on the network, then the neutral principles must apply. And the second is they can't cross-own. They can't own, like Google can't own the company that is competing with Yelp. So just so you guys understand, you type in a name and want to figure out like which restaurant you should go to? And Yelp has been building this business for a long time, trying to make sure that you then trust their judgments. Well, Google is directly competing with Yelp in the, whatever you call this, in this rating service. And it's allowed to do that under our current law. That makes it really hard for new competitors to come up, for the competitors to Yelp to come up and build new services. It really quashes the creativity in our economic system, and then also has these side political effects. So I would think those are the broad principles that we should approach: is no cross-ownership, no vertical integration, and neutrality.
I'd agree with that completely. I think the cross-ownership issue is really significant because I think to some degree network effects and certain aspects of online markets do necessitate that these companies are more valuable to us when they are semi-monopolistic. But I think the combination of the horizontal monopoly with the vertical integration is really what poses these extreme conflicts of interest. And these companies are then incentivized to abuse that conflict of interest, and current laws make that permissible. I think this problem is especially acute in information markets. So we used to have a principle that if you owned the pipes, you couldn't also produce the content. And that's a principle that we totally stepped away from. And we saw that with the NBC-Comcast merger. So you have a single company both owning the pipes and producing the content. We also see that on the table now with AT&T and Time Warner, where if those companies are allowed to merge, you'll kind of see that similar dynamic. And so I just would say that, platform markets in general invite us to kind of reassert this principle, banning vertical integration. But I think as platforms also become like media markets, media industries, this principle becomes especially important because information is at stake.
So Corinne, how do you think about the question of internet platforms in the context of antitrust? Do you see this as an antitrust problem, something that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, so in the last 30 years, there's been a lot of economics, starting with David Evans and others, on how to look at these markets. And again, I'm looking at it from an antitrust perspective under our current regime, not any kind of political, because we sort of pride ourselves in the antitrust community that we're not political. And that there's consistency, in analysis over administrations. And, the analysis, multi-sided platforms, basically the idea is that you can use additional existing antitrust tools, but you need to look at both sides of the platform. So often one side of the platform is offered for free to incentivize users, and the other side is charged. And so you need to look at both sides when you're looking at price increases or market power, and that some of the traditional merger simulations, traditional empirical, some of the traditional economics used needs to be modified for multi-sided platforms to take them both into account. And on the political issue, I'm just surprised because I've heard I'm testifying in Congress next week on this report that the U.S. Chamber put out where they do want antitrust to be more political. And that terrifies me. I was in Asia 8 times last year, and I heard all, people, asking, training enforcers and training about 400 enforcers and judges, and they were very concerned that under Trump, antitrust would become political. And, I was able to say, I certainly hope not, and that we have a long history of, regardless of the regime, the administration, we really look at theories of harm that give us testable implications, and that's our answer, and not politics.
So I'm a little surprised that you say that for a couple of reasons. One, it seems like we need to distinguish between two kinds of things. The first thing is something that's political in the sense that a specific administration is targeting an individual or an individual company or something like that for personal or political small p reasons. The second thing is the broad consideration of kind of political or systemic factors in consideration of the structure. And in that sense, antitrust as it currently exists seems to be wholly political. In that any sort of legal system is designed on a set of normative foundations that have embedded into them a set of political preferences. And it seems like Zephyr, I think, outlined pretty well that there's a set of political preferences built into the Chicago kind of Borkian antitrust system that we currently have. So I think we need to be clear about separating those two things out, and I think Zephyr wanted to jump in on this question.
No,
as well.
that's all I wanted to do is say that there's, when we are, say, designing, saying, well, we want to have independent redistricting commissions, that's because we have certain commitments to a politics that doesn't allow representatives to draw their own lines, right? So there's a politics behind that. And that is the sense in which antitrust should be concerned with political issues, not in the particular case. And those are very, very distinct ideas of political.
I think it's also hard when you have, I thought it was interesting, Zephyr, when you started out saying that Citizens United, is an antitrust case. But, bridging those two with the political, when you have a political system that is beholden to corporate interests and big corporate money, then you're not going to see, I think, a lot of the enforcement of, on the political side, of a robust antitrust regime. And so, especially if you're going to center the consumer, then the courts become even more important. And so I think it's hard to really keep it in that non-political, in the negative way, which I agree with you that, that kind of like targeted for-profit gain of the politicians is a very bad way to go about antitrust policy. But when you take the courts out of that equation, which I think the Supreme Court has in many cases taken itself out of the equation by making it harder for plaintiffs to get into court, to say that, for example, in the American Express Italian Colors case, that it's okay to shunt consumers who have a complaint about antitrust, about monopolistic behavior, that they can be shunted into arbitration proceedings that don't allow classes, when the reality is if you're just going on as an individual plaintiff, because your individual harm, could be 55 cents and is not going to be something that you're going to go through the whole legal process to vindicate, then you're essentially saying that we're okay with the fact that these antitrust claims won't be brought at all in the courts by these individuals. So I think that's a very problematic layer added to the fact that you have a lot of big corporate money being put into the political and legislative arenas.
So let's talk for a second about courts. As we've said, this antitrust in general is an area where the court is a major force and is almost a common law player, effectively, in theory, interpreting the statutes. Is that a bad thing in general? Should we be? Is the way to address the problems in antitrust to get rid of the courts out of this system, to have a new statute, delegate power to the FTC or some other agency to issue rulemakings, and turn this into a traditional form of administrative law? Is the answer to give more authority to the courts, but under a different set of guidance than they've had under the Sherman and Clayton Acts? So I'm just curious, how do you think about the role of the court going forward, in particular in light of Elizabeth's opening comment, which is this has become increasingly over 30 years a polarized partisan issue where you see decisions breaking up in part based on the kind of pro-business nature tilt of the justices?
Well, I'm a litigator, so I like courts. So, part of me is naturally inclined to say don't take it out of the courts because then I wouldn't have anything to do, and that would be bad. So I guess I would like there to be a different way that the courts look at this, particularly at the outset, even before we get to the substance of the antitrust regime. I think that is to me one of the most disturbing parts of the trend in antitrust doctrine is what we've seen in other substantive areas of law, which is closing the courthouse doors frequently. So from my perspective, I think having the courts and when we think of the way that the founders designed our constitutional democracy, they wanted the courts to always be there to vindicate important rights and interests of the people. And so I wouldn't want to take the federal judiciary out of that. But maybe just if I could stack the Supreme Court with different justices, that'd be what I'd do.
I think it's not an either-or question. I think if we're acknowledging antitrust to be foundational to our democracy because we believe that the distribution of control and power is critical, then I think you want to create a system where it's not whether this principle gets enforced or not, is not just writing on the 9 justices. I think you do want a new antitrust statute because I think the common law reading of it has gotten to a point where it is difficult to bring cases. That said, I think private enforcement was actually really key to the founding of antitrust, and I think at that time, the idea that private plaintiffs would also be bringing these cases was something that was great reassurance that we wouldn't just be at the behest of public enforcement. So I think that's a system that we do want to maintain. That said, I do think there are ways to embed competition policy principles into the administrative state. So in the same way that agencies currently have to do cost-benefit analyses whenever they are issuing kind of new regulations, I think having them assess kind of the effects on market structure, whether concentration will be rising as a result of their policies. I think that's something we could be seeing. I think areas like government procurement also offer an opportunity for us to be thinking about, how is government basically restructuring these markets? Are we advancing competition or inhibiting it? And so I think just increasing the sites where we are advancing these principles is something that we should be pushing for.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it, the sort of broad site approach. And I guess I hope that we are all now sufficiently shaken to understand that there is not a stable democratic system that we can achieve and then we'll just never move, that will basically work with a few disputes. In some ways, democracy is always in the fight for freedom, and I really do think we're talking about freedom is a kind of whack-a-mole. And so that I don't think we should be trying to solve all of world history. In this particular moment, I think the role of state attorney generals is quite significant, and state public service commissions is incredibly significant. And then, as because we're at ACS, the role of people who are deeply democratic, recognizing that we have a failure in the last 30 years of making antitrust, anti-monopoly, and the fight for distributed power central to the democratic progressive agenda. And so it's distributed not just in the sense Lena says, but in our law schools. I sometimes think that we sort of made this bargain. The right wing takes the corporate world, and we'll take the world of private rights. That bargain isn't working out. It's not even working out on the private right side. But we as progressives have to invest in and recognize that yes, there's new energy in the antitrust arena. There's new people excited about it, new people doing things. But there's not a big ACLU working on this right now. So us together actually have to do a lot of work to engage law students and law schools in a renewed anti-monopoly, antitrust moment.
And to underscore just how far we've come, it's worth just remembering that antitrust was the key issue in the 1912 presidential campaign. How we addressed the powers of the industrial trust was the leading issue on which Roosevelt and Wilson were campaigning. And so it's just worth recognizing, now antitrust is so marginal that at some point it really was central to our politics.
So Corinne, one thing, so this has been a lot about progressive energy around antitrust, but I feel like there's also been a significant amount of conservative energy around antitrust, particularly libertarians being interested in the challenges of licensing that have been happening around the country. Usually this is state licensing boards or these kinds of things, and there's been concerns that there's antitrust problems around that. Can you speak a little bit to how people on the conservative side are thinking about places where we could have reform to increase competition in some of those sectors?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to speak for conservatives. I don't think, again, antitrust is political. When I worked under Chairwoman Ramirez under Obama administration, this was something that was very important to her, and now as Commissioner or Acting Chairwoman Olhausen is continuing, because of federalism. The FTC DOJ, is pretty much limited to competition advocacy. But we've, long, for 30 years under different administrations gone after like state certification of need laws and other governmental barriers to entry, not gone after, but done competition advocacy, advocating, to not have these governmental barriers to entry. And as far as your other question about the courts, I guess I'm just shocked. I feel like I've been dropped into an alternate universe, but I'm really happy because it's helpful for me to know. We when I was at the FTC and the DOJ, when we went abroad to train India and China, everywhere, we would talk about our evolution as something to learn from, the mistakes that we made that we thought when we looked at when Antitrust considered a hodgepodge of sort of social and political and economic goals. The studies that show that it led to maybe prolonging the Great Depression, and we talk about the revolution in the courts as being this amazing thing coming in line with economics, and not with Bork. Bork would have had a total welfare standard looking at both producer and consumer. We do not count producer surplus. But to me, widespread agreement was Chicago and Harvard School. So I guess I'm very shocked. We always touted it as the revolution and telling China that their courts really need to step up and get part, have a part in the evolution of the anti-monopoly law, because right now the agencies in China are really using it for industrial policy, it seems.
So let's open up some questions from the audience. We have a mic up here in the front, so if you just line up, what I'd ask you to do is introduce yourself, your name, where you're coming from, and then a very important thing about questions is they end with question marks. So let's stick to that rule as well.
Hi, my name's John. I'm from New Jersey, the Valley of Humiliation. I wanted to thank you all for coming for the panel, especially you, Professor Teachout. My little brother asked me to thank you for fighting for the Hudson River and that he hopes you beat John Faso next year. My question is about the first Gilded Age, because one of the cool things about that one was that it's over. And, but there are three things that I think have stayed with us, which are arguably good, but, well, two things are good, one is bad. One is the mission, the sense of mission among journalists. Another is the organization of people without political power, notably farmers and workers. And the third, I think, is what we're still talking about, is the rise of corporate money in politics. And I wanted to ask you how you think those three dynamics will play out in this Gilded era. Thanks.
I kind of quit predicting.
Speaking of alternate uses. But
I will say, I'm just going to use it as an opportunity to say something that I think is really important. If we are going to succeed, it is incredibly important to make common cause with small business owners and producers around the country who may not identify as progressive, but feel on a daily basis the tyranny of these big corporations that don't allow them to get their creative ideas and their good business to work. And I think of it sometimes as maybe you've suggested a fourth, a three-tiered stool of labor, small businesses, and the progressive community all working together. But you can't do it without labor, and you can't do it without small businesses. And one of the ways that FDR, this is a small, one of the sort of forgotten parts of the FDR story is how much he engaged not the monopolists, but the people who were getting squeezed out by the monopolists in the New Deal.
So I'm Tim Burns. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. I want to follow up on one of the points Lena made, which was how any of the presidential candidates in 1912 would have been right at home on the stage. And one of the sort of most touching things I read recently was about Woodrow Wilson's campaign stop in Lincoln, where he made a statement that could have been made in my state of Wisconsin, in Janesville today. And what he said was, "Do you want your sons and daughters?" He actually said sons, but I've edited some. Do you want your sons and daughters to grow up in a country where they wait for the next big industrial concern to move to your city here? Or do you want them to grow up in a country where they have the ability to enter fair markets and compete with those concerns? My question, and there really is a question here, is, look, it isn't lost on anybody that there seemed to be a revolt of the rural and small town areas in last November. How much is the failure to make democracy part of the antitrust equation? How much did that lead to the revolt?
It's a big question that I don't feel totally qualified to answer, but yeah, I think thinking about the importance of antitrust and competition to rural communities is really important. I mean, another thing that gets lost is when candidate Obama was campaigning in 2008, he went to Iowa and he talked about antitrust. And one of the reasons that the administration ended up having those huge agricultural hearings was because they'd heard the concerns of farmers around the country. I mean, if you're ever kind of trying to predict what's going to happen in a market once it becomes very concentrated, you should look at agriculture because it is so consolidated, and a lot of the patterns that we end up seeing in other markets, say the dynamics between Amazon and book publishers, they can all be traced back to dynamics that we've seen in agriculture. So agriculture is extremely consolidated. I think farmers are kind of living the day-to-day tyranny, as Zephyr mentioned. And so I think figuring out how to speak to them is a key question. In this past cycle, actually, we saw in Oklahoma a very successful effort to get past kind of anti-monopoly legislation. And I think kind of learning from that and kind of what was happening there is something we should think about.
I just want to say I think the answer is yes, that it was significant, and I'd recommend all of you read Lillian Salerno's recent Washington Post article about a monopoly in rural America and about how that dependency on big corporations means that rural Americans can't have their own thriving, non-dependent local economies.
So one comment for all our questioners, please talk into the mic. They're having a little trouble having it pick up for the recording.
I'm Steve Sussman. I used to work for Hugo Black, who believed that the Sherman Act was written to further our democracy by creating small businesses. And it had nothing to do with efficiency or consumer welfare. But y'all are too young to even know about those. I also used to be the foremost plaintiffs, used to be, antitrust lawyer in the country. I gave that up. Now, I'm hearing things here today that's exciting me a little. But I suggest, Zephyr and Lena, that you've got to figure out how to respond accordingly. You are not making issues. You need to meet her. You need to have arguments against her. You cannot let her get away with saying that it's all about consumer welfare and efficiency, because that's, to her history, what it's been about. You got to go back before the 60s. And you also have to demonstrate, I think, and I don't know whether anyone's trying to do it, that the reason we are in a mess in this country today is that politically we suddenly believe that big was beautiful. And we have let our communications companies, or all 2 or 3 cable companies that provide all the news in this country. Our banks are too big to fail, so we had an economic, no bank merger has been disapproved, okay? I mean, if you look at every ill in this country, you can attribute it to a violation of the antitrust law. So, number one question is, are anyone in the academy, and until someone in the academy begins developing a language to respond to Corinne, okay, to respond to the Chicago School, until you develop a model law that we can take to an ALI meeting and say, here's a new Sherman Act for the 21st century, which we need, because even if I replace the entire Supreme Court with 9 people, we will not undo the history since the Chicago school co-opted the judiciary in this country on antitrust law. I don't believe so. I think we need a new law, but you've got to write it. And once you write it, then people like me can go around and say, this is what we ought to do. and you've got to make a case and attribute all our ills to the past. So now here's a question for you, an antitrust question. Here's an antitrust question for you. I read an article, there was one in the Wall Street Journal last December, that 80% of the stock of public companies in this country is owned by 3 institutional investors. Fidelity, State Street, I forget who, BlackRock. Okay, own 80% of the stock. And through horizontal shareholding, they own 3 or 4% of the stock in competing companies in the same industry, like airlines. The pattern in the airlines is each of those 3 companies own 3 or 4% of every major airline. And some law professors, antitrust professors, have written an article, which I'm sure you are aware of, Professor Posner from Chicago and L. Haig from Harvard, saying that violates the Clayton Act, which prohibits any company from buying a share of stock if the likely effect is substantially less than competition. And then in come some economists who have done some studies that show that where these companies, airlines or banks, are subject to this horizontal ownership, the prices are higher than they would be otherwise. Okay?
Yeah.
Sounds like a pretty good antitrust case for them. No one has jumped on it. The Justice Department hadn't said it then. There's the problem.
So,
What's your analysis of that?
Well,
so
that
horizontal
yeah.
horizontal shareholding in airlines. Is anyone working on this beyond the academics?
Well, your answer excited me because you're going to be part of writing the next Sherman Act, which was called at the time a Charter of Liberty. A Charter of Liberty. It wasn't called the Consumer Welfare Statute. And it's true. I should engage with Corin. The understanding of consumer welfare is terrible history. It has nothing to do with the debates at the time. It is terrible for our democracy, and it is terrible policy and terrible law. And I'm not going to waste our time going through all of that. But nobody can defend it on historic grounds. It's just nonsense as a matter of history. So you have to believe that it was worth having a judicial revolution against the initial purposes of these terrible liberty-based purposes, and at least winning on the consumer front. And as a friend of mine says, as if we rewrote "we the people" to "we the consumer." And there's a deep philosophical problem of thinking of consumer as the heart as opposed to citizen as the heart of our country. But I want to be brief. I think there's a huge problem of cowardice that spans Democratic and Republican administrations in enforcement. And I don't think it can be just put down to revolving door. Although I think revolving door is part of it, and I do believe that I don't have an answer to that, but we've puzzled on that too. Like, where are Section 2 cases in the Obama administration? Where's the leadership there? And I think all we know is it's not working, and we need major shakeup in who's leading that, the kind of personnel. The next time we have a Democratic administration, we should demand the same with a Republican administration.
So let me I actually want to push a question a little bit on this. So it seems to me that the strong argument in favor of the consumer welfare standard is an administrability argument. So putting aside history, politics or democracy, any of that stuff, it is that in theory it should be easier to manage figuring out what is going to benefit consumers, and judges it's very hard for judges to deal with kind of fuzzy standards, and so this is something that looks a little more rule-like because you can get experts, you can actually do economic modeling, and you can figure out, and that's an administrability kind of an argument. So I guess my question, where I want to push is, what's the response to an administrability concern that's independent of neoliberal economic theory or something like this? It's just administrability is the real reason we would want to do this, because that seems to be the best possible argument that you could bring. Is there a good response to that?
Sure. I think I'd underscore that I think the administrability challenges are exaggerated when compared with the number of kind of indeterminate, the indeterminate inquiries that are currently done under the current standard. So I think kind of taking into account other factors would not be hugely anomalous. Again, it is something that we did for the majority of the last century through the 70s, and we managed okay. I do think it's a real question, but I think thinking about, kind of offering new ways to think about this is something that's going to be important.
Well, the thing about a structural approach, so an approach where you say we need to have a lot of competitors in order to have a competitive market, is not that, and which is an approach that was an administrable approach, is not an approach where in any given situation you have to decide on whether this company is going to become a tyrant or not. It's that you understand that without competitors in a market, without actual you need competitors for competition. And one of the many things the Chicago School did is say you can have competition without competitors. And you just heard Corinne say that. She said it in a different way, but she said you have these potential competitors. I mean, all the potential competitors to Amazon, they're lining up outside. Anyway, it's not that in the particular case, it's that you have a default skepticism about concentration. That default skepticism infuses everything that you do.
Corinne, you were invoked, so I'll let you respond if you want to. Okay.
I just wanted to say quickly, I think the whole point is that you can't put that stuff aside. You can't put aside liberty and democracy, and that is where I think your comment about we need to, as progressives, have our own language. So pushing back, this important debate about whether the consumer welfare standard is historically correct or et cetera, but have that debate, but also have our own affirmative language. And I think for progressives, we need to make sure we're not just arguing within the School of Chicago building, that we go outside that building, open the door, and I think the way that we open the door is through invoking, key ideals to progressives that also happen to be historically relevant to antitrust, which is democracy and liberty and equal citizenship.
And just to underscore what Zephyr said, I mean, I think kind of looking to structural separations as a way to make these kinds of things more administrable is something that's really key, and something that we also did, kind of clear bans on certain forms of vertical integration, for example.
Okay, first of all, I'm taking notes on my phone.
Can you get closer to the mic?
Sorry, I'm taking notes on my phone. I'm not checking Facebook. So I'm a law student. I'm a law student at Michigan. And my question is sort of, as many people have said, this isn't happening. There's not this language. There's not, at least except in small spaces like this, there doesn't seem to be people really doing this. So if this is something you care about, you might go into DOJ antitrust or FTC, but this isn't what they're doing. So the question is, how do I get involved? What do I do? What can law students actually do to, A, help change the language, and B, be in a place where this is actually getting talked about and getting handled?
Do you want to talk about what you did at Yale?
Sure. So I recently graduated and kind of had a similar experience where, before law school, I had worked as a journalist, kind of calling up farmers, asking how certain mergers had affected them, and kind of really having an on-the-ground experience of how market power works. And then I get to school and kind of enter an antitrust classroom, and the conversation is just radically different. You don't talk about power. It's very different. I mean, I think it requires a few things. I mean, one is it really does require new ways of thinking and talking about this. And so I think, academia, new academic articles, I think organizing, there is actually a growing number of students, it seems like, interested in economic power issues. And I think the kind of dichotomy that Zephyr alluded to, where kind of like the conservatives take private law and progressives take private rights, I think that's kind of fissuring a little bit in the wake of the financial crisis. And so I think you are seeing more and more law students interested in economic power issues and embracing them as sites of progressivism. So I think continuing to kind of create those communities is something more important, be it in financial regulation, as well as antitrust, as well as, say, IP law. We also had a really big conference at Yale to talk about these issues. But I think it's something that, we're hoping that forums like ACS can help kind of continue and promote.
So I'll just add to that, if you're interested in these things, so to promote some people here and not here, I'd encourage you to start by looking up Lena Khan's articles. including most recently one in the Yale Law Journal called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, which talks a lot about these issues at a whopping, 90 pages. I think you can, it'll take up a wonderful afternoon. You should also go ahead and take a look at Barry Lynn's book called Cornered from a few years ago, which describes a lot of these transitions. And then there's a number of journalists who write about these kinds of things, Dave Dayan, Matt Stoller, who are working heavily on these kinds of questions. So there's a growing set of people who are interested in these things. So for anyone out there interested, I would start by doing some reading in these areas and following those people, say on Twitter and elsewhere, and you'll learn more about where people thinking about reform in this area are going.
My name is Caroline Poplin. My credential now is that I'm older than all of you. I started law school in 1969, and I remember when things were different. One of the things that changed was that the idea that the only value a corporation should have is maximizing shareholder value, that's its single purpose. That started in the 1970s with Chicago. It didn't used to be that way. My question is, when I started out, mergers and acquisitions was just not a big deal. I mean, there was some acquiring going on in the 60s, LTV and things like that. But in the 80s, mergers and acquisitions became a huge specialty in law firms. I think it was probably the most, they made the most money. Some law firms do nothing else. First there were favorable mergers, and there were hostile mergers, and the Goldman Sachs and the investment banks are built on acquisitions and mergers. And I'm wondering how much of this has been the tail wagging the dog. I mean, how much is initiated by corporations and how much is initiated by these intermediaries who are looking for deals to do and promoting deals? Should we be doing something about that?
Thoughts from panelists?
I guess the only third thing I would add to that is how much, you're asking like how much of this is spurred by the companies doing it versus how much is spurred by the intermediaries doing it. Exactly. I think the third thing is like, and how are they responding to the existing law? So I think, one of the questions, one of the kind of debates is like, how was the Obama administration on antitrust issues? Because in the last couple of years, there were certain mergers that did not get through. The prime example being Comcast, the Comcast merger. And I think when thinking about those issues, I mean, these are massive mergers that are being proposed, and the fact that these companies have the gall to even suggest that we have these massive concentrations, I think just gives insight into how they view and understand the current state of antitrust law. And so I think, how companies understand whether, enforcers are going to be aggressive or not is also something that's a key thing in this.
I think your question, the answer is it's a critical role, and that I sort of backed into antitrust from like election law. And then I'm backing into finance from antitrust. And that they're deeply, deeply connected, and that we have to have an approach not just in the explicit antitrust community, but in the incentives in the financial sector.
So I'll just add one other thing to that I think is important for everyone to get, that if you're thinking about ways, if your concern is concentrations of economic power and the exercise of economic power, what you've heard across the panel, and I think your question adds an important component to it, is a variety of sectors where this happens. So one is antitrust, where the kind of basic theme is something like breaking up power. A second is public utilities or common carrier regulations, where the idea is you're going to keep the power big, but you're going to regulate it heavily in certain ways. Neutrality, for example, open access, and that's a form of regulating the abuses of power. A third area is corporate law and the design and structure of corporate law, in which we've moved heavily to a shareholder primacy and profit-oriented model. But throughout our history, there have been other versions of thinking about that, including forms of workplace democracy, cooperatives, and lots of other forms of internal structuring of corporations in order to control power. And then a fourth category, which we haven't talked about much today, is labor and labor law, and that's in a way a version of the workplace democracy, but expands on it in some other ways too. So there are multiple ways that we might think about addressing, and so I just want to throw that out there, because the important part about it, and I hope that you take from this in part, is that the public and private law sectors intersect in all of these areas. So these traditional areas that are imagined as sort of private, the antitrust people in law schools hang out with the corporate people, not with the regulatory people, are not actually private in any real sense because they're about structuring the economy, which has these big political, legal, constitutional implications. And so for the students out there, especially who are thinking about corporate law or taking corporations, you should absolutely do that. But you should also be thinking about how this system operates within these broader kind of political economy dynamics.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to add labor law in there. I'm Mark Gruenberg, and I cover labor law a lot. And we touched on it here. But the dynamic of this increased monopolization affects workers. It affects workers in the Gilded Age. It affects workers in the 20s. And it's doing it now. So let's talk about that. How bad is it?
So actually what I'm going to do, because we're running out, I'm going to take one more, I'm going to take two at a time from now on. So why don't you give us your question too?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to address Corinne and the idea that anything that's not considering consumer welfare as politicizing antitrust, as Zephyr pointed out, is inherently political. And as Ganesh also pointed out, it seems like the problem is more maintaining neutrality and administrability than simply politicization. And it, just from where I sit, and I'm by no means any kind of an expert in antitrust, is that the things we consider are efficiency and whether or not the costs are low for consumers in this consumer welfare metric. In your mind, is there any other things that we could consider? Because this is very clearly a system that is, trusts are inherently efficient and they're willing to keep costs low in order to maintain their market share. So are there other things that we could consider under consumer welfare than efficiency and low prices without politicizing, in your view, antitrust law?
So maybe let's start with that, Corinne, and then we'll move to a broader conversation about labor.
So, I mean, if you're using consumer welfare as used in microeconomics, you know, the way you're looking at it for antitrust is our prices going up or output going down. I think the analysis is very difficult. I think the analysis is, having done cases for years, very difficult already to look at consumer welfare and balance and weigh anti-competitive and pro-competitive. So I don't know personally, I just don't understand how to look at other factors, how to weigh and balance them across different markets. So if you were to say a merger is going to give us this much consumer welfare, now how do you balance that against inequality or poverty, or I just don't know without, you know, having government officials, you know, sort of be central planners and make decisions that I'm not comfortable with them making.
I feel very strongly about the labor point, and there's a bit of a history here that labor both was the target of antitrust laws for a long time, and then also labor would often, in the realm of things that you cared about, say, okay, we're not going to cause any problems with these mergers. In fact, labor tended to be fairly, if not accepting, pro-merger for a long time, and then there have been some important breaks in recent years. The AFL-CIO's important involvement in what became Dodd-Frank, and then CWA in particular moved from a pro-merger to anti-merger position in the last 10 years, and then has come out front and actually been a real leader in standing up against mergers. I think of it almost like and then there were none problem. Like if there's 3 companies you're working with and you're negotiating with the management of those 3 big companies, this works. But when you're down to 2 or 1, you're not getting any benefits. You're not winning on wages. You're not winning on benefits. You're not winning on outsourcing. And I think the history is unfortunate, but it's an incredibly important alliance to build. Is an alliance between anti-monopolists, again, I just want to reiterate, small businesses and labor, because small business and labor don't often work together. But this is an area where they can.
I think the labor point is really important, and I think Zephyr saying that we need to bring our side together on that. Is important in a reflection, which is that the opponents to, you think about we talked about the Federalist Society agenda. Well, one of the agenda items is not just undermining antitrust enforcement and protections, but also undermining organized labor, and that's not an accident. And so when we think about you mentioned some of the good things that came after the first Gilded Age of organization of farmers and workers, we're seeing a severe threat to organized labor, and from the court's perspective, it's only going to get worse because we're likely going to see the other shoe drop in the fair share fees case that was kicked last term in the Friedrichs case, but is making its way rapidly back up to the court.
So let's take these last two questions, and then we will give everyone a chance to respond to those and make some concluding remarks.
Thank you. My name's Steve Williams. I don't have a question, but I had a comment in response to Steve Sussman and what he said about the airlines and cross-ownership by
Can you
investors.
put a question mark at the end of it?
I just want to fill something in. That case is going on. It's going on now. I'm lead counsel. It's in the District of Columbia before Judge Collar-Catelli, and it's proceeding and going forward. So those cases are happening, and I think the one point I'm making, particularly for the law student, is private enforcement of antitrust laws has always been critical both on a state and federal level, and that's a perfect example.
So one thing I'll say to our law student who is up here before, you should bug him for a summer internship later.
Exactly.
That's something you can do to get involved.
Hi, my name is Stephen Spitz. I went to the University of Chicago Law School. I am anti the Chicago school. I had antitrust law from Ken Dam, and I was a U.S. history major undergraduate. And there was no relationship between antitrust law and actually the word antitrust. And what I mean by that is the original intent, for those who may follow Scalia's originalism notion, the original intent was to break up the trusts. Teddy Roosevelt, the whole impetus, and it wasn't just economic, it was political power. What followed from the breaking up of the trusts from the Sherman and the Clayton Acts were 4 constitutional amendments: the federal income tax, the women's right to vote, the ending of the corruption of the state legislature selecting United States senators. These were significant political responses to economic power and political power by the trusts. So why don't we get back to the original notion of the antitrust, which is to break up this concentration of economic and political power that follows from the economic power.
So with our last few minutes, why don't we just go down the line? Everyone can have a last word, and I think this question tees that up nicely.
Great. Well, thank you for introducing yourself. And just to sort of add a flourish to that, again, in my anti-corruption founding era research, one of the things that came out is that half of the initial Congress's bills had a private enforcement mechanism because they were so concerned that private power would get captured that public power would get captured by private power, that you need to have that outlet. And in the many different kinds of ways that we can address this, and I do think we need new antitrust laws, but we also need to be both defending and expanding the ability to bring private lawsuits, which are absolutely under attack. It's been a very exciting session. I think I've talked a lot, so I have very little else to say except this panel is there. I've been interested in this world for 5 or 6, maybe 8 years, been involved in this, and there's been growing interest, and there's growing excitement, and there were antitrust questions asked of Judge Gorsuch, which is very exciting, but the community is still really small. So I hope you don't go away and say, I'm so glad somebody's taking care of this. I want you to go away and say, we are actually in a fight for our lives right now, for our freedoms in this country, and if we don't pay attention to the concentration of power and actively in our political activism, in our lawyerly work, and in our policy work and op-eds, actually engage on the concentration issue, we're going to wake up 5 years from now and wonder where we were.
I think the private enforcement point is critical, and it really underscores how antitrust was, and the private enforcement component of it was really seen as a way to safeguard against regulatory capture. And antitrust used to be a Republican issue. Senator Sherman, who passed the Sherman Act, was a Republican. And so I think, talking about the different coalitions that we can build, bringing in farmers and small businesses, really create an opportunity for this to be a bipartisan issue. On the economic and political power question, I think that's also super important. I mean, I think one of the major reasons that Justice Brandeis on this issue was so incredible is because he understood that the political power of monopolies comes not just through the fact that they translate their economic power into political power. It's not just a question of, campaign finance or kind of buying off legislatures, but it's that when you have such immense concentration of power, our experience of that is intrinsically political. And I think kind of changing the ways in which we understand corporate power and seeing it as a form of governance is also something that's really critical to kind of moving things in this way.
I guess I'll just say that, to remember that antitrust is a pretty blunt instrument, with treble damages. And so to the extent that you want to consider other factors other than consumer welfare, to me that counsels even more for doing it in another context and with other people who have that expertise.
Well, I loved the last question, particularly as a progressive originalist, so I appreciate that getting back to thinking about the amended Constitution as well, I think is incredibly important because a lot of times when people talk about the Constitution, they want to end it in 1789, but there are a lot of important progressive reforms exactly that you talk about that were a reaction to increased concentration of economic power, and the direct election of senators is a great example, and also the campaign finance laws that were put into place for the first time in that era as well. So I think that broadening the conversation to these fundamental principles that progressives hold dear is something that I'm glad that was sussed out in this conversation, and I think that we should all continue to think about whether we're antitrust specialists or not, because we all care about democracy.
So I want to thank all of you for coming today. I think what you've seen today, and this is actually a pretty special panel, particularly because this is a set of issues and ideas that, as I think both Zephyr and Lena said, are emerging and becoming more and more interesting and more powerful, even just in the last few years. So again, as we said, don't take this to be that lots of people are working on this. Take this as an opportunity to get on the ground floor of lots of people like Lena, Zephyr, and others who are trying to push forward a kind of new agenda for thinking about the concentration of economic power and seeing how that plays in with the traditional approach over the last 30 years of thinking about consumer welfare. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming and invite you to join us all for lunch, which will be in the presidential ballroom, which is the big ballroom just down the way. And Senator Mazie Hirono from Hawaii will be the person giving the address at lunch. So please join us all there. It starts immediately. So thanks.